so excited to be here. For anyone who may not know, my name is Kjirstin Almos. I was the former Children's and Youth Ministry Director here, and I've been doing a series on Leviticus the last 4 Sundays as part of my Master of Divinity degree and a class on Christian education for adults. Just as I always like to begin us with prayer, so let us go to God in time of prayer. Holy and eternal God, we thank you for this time that we have been given, that we can delve into your word. I ask that you make this time indeed holy and consecrated, and help us to grow more into the holy people that you have called us to be. I ask that we just still our hearts and are able to be present here to your word and how you are speaking to us today. We pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, so let's just do some review, because we've talked about an awful lot of things. As always, I'd just like to start off with just talking about why we're studying Leviticus. And today especially, we're going to have a really great understanding of Jewish culture and a lot of where it's come out of the Old Testament, and really have a connection to our Old Testament ancestors. I kind of joked last week that this is the fun week because we're talking about partying and social justice. So that's a really great connection we're going to have this week, just learning how our ancestors did that. As always, I like to point out that because we're studying a particularly dense book from the Bible, that it's difficult. And what I always encourage us to do is just to let the book speak for itself. What I mean by that is trying to kind of leave behind as much as we can from the 21st century, and especially even behind those judgments that we want to bring, and just kind of letting the Bible speak to us from its own time. Not that we can't bring our own thoughts to it later, but just to give it that chance to speak to us as it is. Alright, so let's talk about some of the things we have covered in the last few weeks. So first off, we talked about the fact that Moses did not actually write the Torah. It was constructed from many different authors over hundreds of years. Leviticus is written mostly by what we call the priestly source. The priestly source would have come out of around the 500s in BCE, and the priestly source was really living out of a pastoral crisis, living out in the time when the exile has happened, the nation of Israel has been completely destroyed by outside forces, and they're trying to figure out how we're going to live and how are we going to worship God when we're in another nation and we want to get back to our home. And they eventually do get back to Israel, and how do they live like that? And there are 2 parts to Leviticus, the priestly source and the holiness code. The priestly source is responsible for more of Leviticus. We talked about that a lot. The holiness code we talked a little bit about last week, so I'll get to that in a second. The second week we talked about the sacrificial system, which contains 5 different types of offerings. The Day of Atonement, it was a really important part of the system as well, because it pulled in 2 different types of offering, and it was the day where the nation of Israel was cleansed from their sin, which theologically was really important to them, because they're trying to get back into the land, they want to stay in the land, and part of their beliefs was we need to live in such a place that a holy God can also live here with us and be with us. Part of that was then they needed to make sure it was clean enough there for a holy God to be there. We also talked that week about the sacrifice metaphor for salvation, looking at our faith as Christians today, talking about the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews presents this idea that Jesus is the perfect sacrifice, and that because of that there's no need for a sacrificial system anymore. And that's of course something that we still live out today in our understanding of Christ and what Christ did for us on the cross. Alright. So last week then, still working out of that idea of Israel wants to live as this holy nation, holy, really thinking about being set apart, we had to talk a little bit about their ethical understandings that were kind of influencing the book of Leviticus. This is where we got into the purity codes that were Leviticus 11 through 15. That was the priestly author. They were saying that's how we're going to live so that we're a holy nation. And then we had the holiness code, which was just that. We will be a holy nation. This is how we're going to live. And they really just kind of instructed them on how to do that. So we talked a little bit about, this is where you get into those weird laws, like you can eat this animal, you can't eat that animal, you have to live this way, you can't live this way. And a lot of it was really just working out of this, I kind of said that we have the answer to a question we don't know they were asking. Like we have this code we have to live by, and we don't quite know how they got to that code. But it was all under this idea of how are we going to live as this nation that's set apart. This nation that's showing other nations around us there's something special about us because we are called by God to be this special group. So now we're getting towards the end of Leviticus. We're still working out of now a part that's about, or written by, the Holiness Code author and the Priestly Source author. The last 4 chapters were a little bit mixed, we think. We don't exactly always know who's writing which part, or what might be more likely is it's holiness code, but then the priestly author edited a bit, because there's certain parts that are certainly very dry and formulaic, which is what we call the priestly author. They're very dry, very just kind of point blank about how they're going to talk about everything. But then we also kind of get some of those things that we know from the holiness code, like you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So they're a little bit mixed right now, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what we get to in Leviticus 23, which is where it just goes through the calendar of festivals for the year. Now there's really 2 main times of festivals. First off, we're going to start off with the spring festivals. And the first spring festival we have is Passover, and Passover is really a couple different festivals kind of put together in one. And a lot of this, if it should sound familiar to you, if you've heard the Exodus narrative for Passover. So Passover starts it has Passover offering the 14th day of the first month. And then you have the festival of unleavened bread. If you remember that from Exodus, that they had to go so quickly, the bread couldn't rise, so it's unleavened. That's the next day. And the offering of first fruits is after that. The Bible's not as clear about what specific day the offering of first fruit occurs. What the offering of first fruits is just that it's offering up to God the first fruits of the crop. But those are all pretty much in the same time period. They're all within a couple weeks of each other. It's kind of a cluster of festivals. It's in the spring. Interestingly, many of you may know from if you have Jewish friends or just simply are aware of certain Jewish holidays, the Jewish New Year takes place in the fall in the terms of how they count the years. But this is actually the beginning of their year. It's the first month. So it's kind of like for us in the church how we, of course, in the larger secular world, we have January 1st as a new year. But we, the church, start our year on Advent in December or November. It's kind of like that. Now, the second festival that takes place in the spring is called the Festival of the Weeks. It's occurred about 7 weeks, around 50 days after the offering of the first fruits. It's also called Pentecost because it's 50 days. And I'm sure it's not hard for us to draw some connections between these 2 things. And if you ever hear of us talk about the Paschal mystery, that's coming from Passover as well. So we have so many connections between Christ and Easter and Passover, and then of course to have 50 days later, and we have our own Pentecost. Okay. So then we move to the fall festivals. In the next slide, I'm going to give more of a picture of this, because I like looking at that, so we can kind of see how it all plays out in terms of a year. But we go from the spring, we jump down to the fall, and the first day of the 7th month, we have the Festival of the Trumpets, which I find really cool as a name. Today, it's really, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. This is where they celebrate the new calendar year. And so whenever they're talking about dating in the Jewish calendar, they're going by this as the first date. They're not going by Passover in the first month there with that. Again, I don't know how much you guys have been able to interact with Jewish culture, but this is the time when the shofar blower will come. Does anyone know a shofar blower? Mm-hmm. That's a ram's horn that's been turned into a trumpet. And it's a very holy experience for Jewish people to do that, or to hear that. And that's something that still happens today. I've worked in hospitals as a chaplain, and we do actually have shofar blowers come, and we'll just go to Jewish patients and be like, would you like to hear the shofar today? And they get to blow it. And we've had people cry after hearing it. It's a very, very meaningful experience. So that kind of starts off the holidays. So that's the first day of the 7th month. We then move into the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day of the 7th month. And we've talked about that, like I said. The Day of Atonement, as I just said, was theologically important because that's the day that cleanses Israel, that cleanses them of their sins. Obviously, it's not celebrated in the same way today because in past times, the Day of Atonement was celebrated with sacrifices, which is obviously something that doesn't happen right now, in part because there's no temple in Jerusalem. So then we move from the 10th day of the 7th month to the 15th day of the 7th month, where we go to the Festival of the Booths, which you now might also hear called Sukkot. I was really interested to learn that Sukkot is really considered the most joyous celebration in the Jewish tradition. And the reason they celebrate it is it's like a memory holiday. They call to memory the time they were wandering in the desert, and they had to live in these temporary dwellings called booths. So that's why it's called the Festival of the Booths. Sometimes what people will do, Jewish people will do with this holiday, is they will build kind of this little structure like a booth, and then they celebrate in there a lot. So then just to kind of put this all together so we can kind of look at it in terms of a calendar. And this we can see correlates a little bit with our months. Now, something to point out that I'm sure many of you know is that the dates of these things change. It's not like for us where we have Christmas is always December 25th. Part of the reason these dates change, because it seems like they shouldn't, right? It should always be, if it's the first day of this month, it should always be the same. The Jewish calendar doesn't quite follow 365 days a year. It's more based on a lunar cycle. So this is all kind of approximate. But you can really see here, we've got these two main times of festivals, in the spring and in the fall.
Is it okay? Question here? Or?
Yeah, please.
I'm a little confused, and maybe you can't clarify, because maybe there isn't a clarification, but the first month isn't their new year.
It's not.
So
So the first month is Nisan, right here.
Right.
So this is the first month, and I think it's kind of like talking about a liturgical calendar versus like a civil calendar.
Okay.
So here's where we're starting our religious year. Here's where we're starting our, right here with the trumpets, that's where we're starting like our calendar year. And so like when they talk about, because like, I have to remember, I think this year by the Jewish calendar is like 5,779 or something like that. They're counting that from this day. What they're counting from Nisan is kind of like how we have the liturgical calendar. So like right now we're in ordinary time. And ordinary time will go until the Christ the King Sunday. Yeah, so that's in the very end of November. And then that's the last day of the liturgical year, but it's only November for us. Right after that, we go into Advent. And that's the beginning of the church year. So it's kind of like that. Obviously, we only have about a month in between our 2 years as Christians working in the secular world. Here, there's a little bit more of a distance, and I don't quite know the history on that, like how that came to be or why, but at the same time, I don't know the answer for the Christian tradition as to why we start on Advent, why we did it the way we did. It's one of those things that evolves over so many years, and this is where we end up. Are there any other questions actually about, this is a good time for questions, because then we're going to jump into the year of Jubilee, so.
If the first fruits are in the spring, are they like not ripened fruit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is like, what are the first fruits that are coming up in the spring? 'Cause that's what was my first thought too. I'm a pseudo farm kid, and I'm just thinking like, I don't know what that would exactly be. And that's where like I was a little confused. The Bible's got a little less information on that one. I think it was a little bit more about spacing out between these three things. So it's kind of three things in one, right? You've got Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. And so I don't quite know, I couldn't quite tell from the actual like biblical writing what that was, particularly because Pentecost, then the 50 days of 7 weeks, that's also kind of doing the same thing. Because by the 7 weeks, you do actually have first fruits from your agricultural season. And that's one thing I wanted to point out too, is that, so you've got spring festivals, fall festivals. If you look at your agricultural seasons, it's at the beginning and it's at the end. And if we are talking about a nation that's coming out of a primitive worldview, there's probably a lot of significance behind that. That's about starting your harvest and ending your harvest. You're turning back over to God.
I thought I had a note from my Bible, not in the Bible, but a note in it, that the first fruits was specifically barley. It was a specific crop, but it was supposedly the first little sprout of that specific crop.
I didn't, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't in the Bible, it was a note in my Bible.
Right, well, I didn't find that in what I was
Okay.
reading, but that could very well be. Because I think the Bible is really talking about, like, not skimping out on God, basically,
Right.
which is a point made many other times in the Bible, that we got to give the best to God. And I think that's certainly made in Pentecost in the Bible, that we're going to give the best to God.
I read that in connection with the giving and the tithing, that the procedure was that they would line up all the animals, and the rabbi would stand there with a stick which had blood on the end of it, and all the animals would pass by the rabbi, and he would touch every 10th one, and that was the offering. And if the owner of that animal did not, for whatever reason, want to sacrifice that animal, he could substitute another animal in its place. So there were some very interesting ways that things were done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Can you repeat that?
So what Will was sharing was that there's a possibility that they would line up the animals, and that a rabbi would touch every 10th one, and that would be the animal that would be sacrificed, or they could substitute. Because actually a little bit of Leviticus talks about that, about other animals that can be sacrificed. And it's very interesting to read all the different ways you can do this. Alrighty, so that's really Leviticus 23 that we just went over, which really, it's kind of interesting to me that the Bible just has a chapter saying, here's the calendar, God has said this is the calendar, do it. We then move into the year of Jubilee. We're still kind of in a calendaring mind, but we're going to expand out of the annual, the yearly calendar, and we're going to look a little bit broader. We're going to look at a longer time frame here. So first off included in this is called the Sabbath year, which occurred every 7 years. During the Sabbath year, there was no farming of the fields. And they really do think this is an agricultural practice that's kind of being codified with this theological belief. Because, and I mean, now I am going to sound like a farm kid, this is still true today. You shouldn't put the same crop in the same field every single year. It depletes certain nutrients in the soil. And so they were saying, most farmers probably figured this out by now, that really the best thing they could do for their crops and their soil is to change them out every so often. But this was really saying in the Bible that, you know what, every 7 years, we're just not going to farm. What's really interesting is God, it says this is like God speaking to Moses, that's how it's written first person. God's saying, okay, now don't worry. In the 6th year, I'm going to give you so much crops, you're going to be fine for 2 years. And you're going to take this year off, and you're just going to worship me a bit more, you're not going to worry, and this is going to we're going to let the land be. And so there's this idea where we're going to worship God. And there's also, again, this idea about the land, right? That there's something significant and special about the land, and we have to take care of it. Because we're coming back to, again, this holy set-apart nation. So then we have the year of Jubilee, which was every 50 years. And I just wanted to read a scripture passage from Leviticus 25:10. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. So the way I kind of like to think of the year of Jubilee is it's like a reset on the entire culture, on the entire economy, on the entire land. Basically, they would completely return back. Every person who was enslaved would be set free. Every original plot of land would be given back to the family who had it first. It's kind of like this big reset. And this is really seen as a form of social justice. And this kind of makes sense to us that scholars point out that up until this point in Leviticus, chapter 25 out of 27, we're not hearing a lot of specific concern for people who might be oppressed, widow, orphan, people who are poor, etc. That didn't really make a lot of sense. If we think of our Old Testament prophets, that's usually who they're crying out about. They're crying about the people who are being ignored. But if you're talking about two different writers who are saying, well, there's going to be this year where we reset everything, they don't need to talk about that, because in theory, it's always going to be taken care of every 50th year.
Is there any history on how long this was actually followed? Because this seems extremely revolutionary.
I was getting there.
Okay.
So just to answer the question, was this ever happening? We don't think so. The question was this happening? Because this sounds pretty awesome, right? Like the word I kept seeing was utopian, right? And then it is. And that's where we have to remind ourselves, because we're looking at this book that likes to have all these rules and all these laws and all these codes. Were these the ideal, or was this what's happening? Or was it somewhere in between? And for the actual year of Jubilee, my argument is it probably wasn't happening. Because we don't have any evidence to suggest that. We don't have any historical sources that are talking about it. We don't see it a lot of other places in the Bible that's actually occurring. And if this is priestly, we have to remember this is pretty late then, this is getting written down. Obviously, the argument's been that what's being written down has been happening in practice for years before. But this could have just been like, we really want this to happen, and maybe if we write it down, we'll start to do it. But one of the reasons I would argue that maybe couldn't is we have to remember the world, especially at the time this was being written down, that they're living into. Yes, they're returning back to the Holy Land. But what happens soon after they get back to the Holy Land? They're under the Persian occupation then, and that's a good time. Persia is remembered favorably in the Bible because they were good to the people. They let them worship God. But eventually the Persians get kicked out. They get replaced by the Greeks, who are not so nice. And they get replaced by the Romans, who are also not so nice. So living in Israel at that time is perilous, it's difficult, there's not a lot of religious freedom, they're not really in charge. I don't really know how in the world they could do this in the same way if they're under occupation. And that being said, we're humans. I don't imagine they'd want to do this because, the idea is to undo people who are very wealthy, especially to undo people who own a lot of land and are benefiting from all the crops that are being grown. We all know that wealthy people probably don't like to give up their wealth, and wealthy people probably have the power. So there's a lot of things I think that were barriers here, but they're making a theological statement that this is important to us and that this is how we care for the people who need protection. So there's an awareness there, even if they can't get it done.
Well, if this is written down, wouldn't that argue for the notion that they actually did this originally? And again, those times were simpler. They were talking about manumission, freeing slaves. They were talking about undoing transactions that perhaps were not wholly legitimate or legal under the code. So it's kind of a reset of those things in a much simpler time. It's a very interesting question as to whether they ever did that or not. But the fact that it's written down, to me, suggests that this is another one of the multiplicity of rules that God laid down as a way to separate the nation of Israel from all the other nations. And like so many other things, the nation of Israel fell away from doing a lot of these things. So perhaps it was there and started to be followed for, 100 years as we think about two cycles of this? Or perhaps maybe it never got done.
Right. So what Will was sharing is, okay, if it's getting written down, it came from somewhere. And really, and I agree with that this wasn't probably just one person said, you know what, year of Jubilee, that's a good idea, let's write that down. It had to come from something a little bit stronger, I think, and some sort of experience. And I could believe it happened probably before the exile, or at least some form of it. I think some sort of idea of this is what we should do. And this maybe was kind of like an idea, like this is how we should do it more formally. What's interesting is you raised the point of, well, it would have been simpler to undo. I'm not as convinced of that because it's every 50 years. So let's think about 50 years of time at this time, especially if you think of someone being enslaved. And what I read a lot about was farmers who, especially if you had a bad year, you could get really behind on your income. And what you would have to do is like the wealthier people would take your land and it's like you would work it for them to like earn a salary. But that's no longer your land. And bearing in mind, 50 years, that's not, people could live fairly long lives, but we're not talking a whole heck of a lot longer than 50 years. Like my example always is, if we think of the exile of 70 years, there were people who would have been very small children or not yet born who never made it back to Israel in 70 years. 50 years isn't much less than that. So if it happened early on in that period, I think it could be really tricky to undo. People could have been enslaved for many, many years, then we undo that.
And even within a family, just the land. The firstborn got half, I think, in the second, so to me, even land within a family that hadn't passed, to me, it would be a little hard to.
Right, and if you think of farmers, like farming is hard work, and you think of what's going to do to their bodies, that's at least like 2 generations of farmers. So it could be hard to undo. What's interesting is that in this chapter, it does talk about like some of the things, they think about it differently, they're supposed to think about it differently, because like the Jubilee year is coming. It's not like it's a secret, it's not like it's the priests only know about it, no one else does. The idea is the whole nation's going to do this together. So, and like some of the things they were talking about was like if you were going to enslave someone, usually slavery was done out of debt. So like you couldn't pay someone back, so you would be enslaved for that. There was like, you have to think about it in terms of how many years you are to the Jubilee. But again, we really don't have a lot of suspicion this was happening. So it's interesting to me that we really think the Sabbath year was happening. We don't think the year of Jubilee was happening.
Well, elsewhere in the Old Testament, we're told that there were sanctuary cities, and if someone had committed a murder or was accused of committing a murder, they could go to that sanctuary city, and they were safe there. So if the year of Jubilee fell while this person was in the sanctuary city, I believe they would be able to get back into the community without this threat hanging over their head. We do this in the Bible Boys, one of the books we studied. We talk about sanctuary cities.
It rings a bell, but a very gentle bell.
Westminster chimes.
Well, that's an interesting question, because basically the question is then, were crimes forgiven? That's what that question's really hinting
Right.
at
In
is,
sanctuary cities, yes.
Right.
well, or even just in the year of Jubilee. And that was not really raised in Leviticus, of whether or not crimes would be forgiven.
That's right, it's somewhere else.
Right. But that's an interesting question: is would we just kind of forgive everyone for all the crimes that have been committed? I think I find it interesting that Leviticus does not say that, and I think there's a reason Leviticus probably doesn't say that. So, okay. So how Leviticus ends. So after all these codes and laws and all these things, it ends on chapter 26, which is a chapter of curses and blessings, which is kind of a normal thing to have in the Old Testament of the Bible. What I just want to point out, because I find it interesting, is that the blessings are 13 verses, the curses are the rest of the book, about 30 more verses. And I found a really great quote from one of my commentaries about that. The number and length of curses generally exceed those of blessings in the law codes. This observation deserves to be mentioned, that the empty-headed who remarked in puzzlement that the curses are more numerous than the blessings have not told the truth. The blessings are stated as generalizations, whereas the curses are stated in detail in order to frighten the hearers. And it is kind of true. And actually what's very interesting is if you dig into these curses, again, it's very much about the land. That if you don't live as you are supposed to, God is going to make the land barren. Things are not going to work well. You cannot live in this nation that God has given to you. We're really getting back to the idea that's kind of underpinning this whole theological outlook and this whole ethical outlook is what are we going to do to make sure the land is a holy land, one that God wants to be in. And then chapter 27 talks about votive offerings. These are more like vows, that's where the word votive is coming from. So they're different from other offerings. So we talked about the sacrificial system where we had to talk about a lot of blood and burning and all those sorts of things. This is not that. This can be money or value. What's actually very interesting is, I think what the point was that the Leviticus is making, like if you wanted to make a vow to the temple and you wanted to do it based on a person, there was different monetary amounts you would pay based on the gender and the age. And so like for little children, it was very low, like you wouldn't pay that much money, and then of course as they got older and were worth more, you would pay more money. Women were typically less than men, which we should be surprised by that by now. And then there was other offerings you could do that could offer animals or land back to the temple. And then the very last verse of Leviticus I just wanted to read. These are the commandments that the Lord gave to Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. So remember, even though we've talked about that, Moses didn't physically write this. This is coming out of a traditional belief that this was given to Moses in a Mount Sinai conversation. And what's really interesting about Leviticus is the way it's been edited is we are to believe that this whole book is written and the people are sitting still. Because in the Torah, if we think about the history of it, especially if we just talk about Moses' history of it, starting in Exodus, there's the actual Exodus, the people are wandering, they get away from Pharaoh's army, so they're out in the desert wandering, and that's where Moses stops on Mount Sinai to have this conversation with God. The entire book of Leviticus is meant to be like this one conversation. And then we jump into Numbers, where we're going to have a few more census, and that's why it's Numbers, and the people start moving again. And they're going to move throughout Numbers and Deuteronomy until Moses' death. So it's been edited to be like that. This is a conversation between Moses and God, or really more God's just speaking, Moses is writing a lot. Okay. All right. So we've kind of reached the end of this journey here, which I mean, I have to acknowledge immediately that we're trying to cover one Bible book in 4 weeks. Even I think some of those short prophets that don't even have more than 2 chapters, it's hard to do that. And especially when we have a book like Leviticus, it's really hard to do that in 4 weeks. So first off, I just want to throw it out for any questions or comments about just what we've covered for today. Which I know we're kind of doing as we go.
Well, we understand that Jews celebrate for holy days today. My question is, what do they sacrifice today? Because they don't sacrifice animals or anything in their temple. Is the sacrifice money?
I think there's money, and also, in some ways, they just say we can't sacrifice. The question is, what do Jewish people sacrifice today if it's obviously not animal sacrifices? And like I said, I've heard Jewish individuals say, well, the temple's not there, so we can't follow the law in the same way. So, and what's interesting then is, we're talking about when the writing of this happened, and there was no temple. That was a national crisis. That was just, astronomical crisis. So we're going on now closer to 2,000 years without a temple in Jerusalem. And I just wonder, I think back to that first century when the second temple was destroyed, if it was that same level of crisis. And what's that lived experience for a Jewish person to say, our holy place, our temple doesn't exist, we can't follow the law that's been given to us and we want to follow. It's a very different experience. And I don't think we as Christians can, we can't quite get that because we just don't live that experience. Just because we've covered a lot in the last few weeks, I also wanted to open it up to any other questions or comments that we've had, just going back over all this information.
Having read Leviticus, I said to my husband, it must have been a bloody mess. What was going on in front of the tent? What is it called? The tent? But what was going on there was all these people bringing all these animals and having to slaughter them in front of this tent. It must have been horrendous.
Mm-hmm. What's being shared is that, this must have been an absolutely mess when we have all this animal sacrifice going on. And if I may share an entertaining story, like I said, I'm a pseudo-farm kid. I grew up in South Dakota. My dad's on a farm. He's a farm boy. And there was some time when I was studying this class originally, I'm on the phone with my dad. I'm having some long theological rant. And God bless him, he's just listening to me. And he eventually just says, God, can you imagine how bad it must have smelled? Like, only a farmer would come back to you and say that. But what's interesting is I was going back through doing like all the prep for this class, and we really talked about this 2 weeks ago when we were really into the sacrificial system. They did drain the blood, and we also talked about the fact that then it had to be drained in a very specific way, and that then they burned everything. Because that was one thing I was thinking about, especially when my dad made the comment about the smell. Is like, yeah, if you kept all these carcasses around and they're just going to rot, yeah, oh my God, that'd be terrible. But if you burn everything to ash, that's very different, and that's what they were doing. So, and if you think too, because they had codes about not touching dead bodies. And I would imagine they had figured out by then that dead bodies attract disease and that they're not sanitary and not healthy. And we really don't want to put that right next to the temple. We don't want to just leave all these carcasses sitting right there. So then it's very fascinating that they burned everything.
That would also have a smell.
True,
Yeah.
but that's a little more temporary.
Yeah.
Like, I will take the burning smell, long before I'll take just rotting carcass.
Right.
I don't know what the Jews call it today, but when the 10 Jewish men get together and they discuss parts of the Bible, is there any contemporary literature from a Jewish standpoint on discussing Leviticus today in the contemporary temple?
So the question is basically do Jewish leaders and scholars get together and discuss Leviticus? I would absolutely imagine they do. I don't know anything specific off the top of my head. Because I know one thing that's been preached about here is that the way Jewish scholars tend to talk to each other is a little jarring for us, is they kind of tend to argue with each other.
Yeah,
that's been the
right.
long tradition.
Yeah.
And I would imagine they do. And what's interesting is some of you may have noticed with this calendar, some of the holidays you've heard of aren't there, right? And part of that comes out of later writings and later interpretations. And some of these interpretations are from the 6th century AD or even later. I believe that's when the Talmud is from, and that's a really important Jewish document. And I don't think it's coded quite the same as the Old Testament scriptures, but it's still really, really important. I think it'd be similar to how in the Catholic Church they have the Bible, and that's of course one source of authority, and then you have an encyclical from the Pope, which is also authoritative, but not the same way. So are they absolutely interpreting this today? Yes, absolutely. I don't know of anything specific or if they're saying different things about it necessarily. I'd be curious to hear from you, all of you, after doing some of this work and reflecting on some of this, just what are the insights or surprises or things you're taking away from having delved into this book?
I think the connection between the sacrifice of animals and in Hebrews, the sacrifice of Christ for our sins, so we don't have to sacrifice any longer.
So the fact that we had the sacrificial system and now that has reached its end through Christ for us today.
I guess I would see it, my own summary would be that this book is all about the holiness of God. And it's all about how you would separate yourself trying to live a holy life, okay, in relationship to a holy God. I see all of these rules. I'm often internally upset when I hear people dismiss the reading of this book or the so-called silly rules, because they are rules that God set forth. He set those forth so that the people of Israel would sacrifice to him properly in a holy way. They would live their lives in a holy way. The priests would do it the right way. They would celebrate all these holidays the right way. They would have a moral code the right way. All of this to separate themselves from the world today with the world of flesh and the devil and all of its temptations. So to me, the book is very relevant. And it's one of the books I heard one of the ministers a long time ago say, there are many books that in the Bible that you don't have to read word by word to get the idea from the book. And I think Leviticus is one of those books. Look for the general ideas. So in trying to summarize it to myself, okay, to me that's what this is all about. God is holy, and we should be holy or try to be as holy as we can be. That's in so many different verses in the various chapters. So to me, that's the big picture.
Yeah.
And the rest of it is very interesting detail brought to mind. If you've ever been to a slaughterhouse, I don't recommend it. You know that I believe the rabbis were very good at slaughtering these animals. You make one slice, and the blood goes out. You have a container that catches it. So it's true that it's an unpleasant process to observe. But if you're observing it in the sense of what is this doing to me, you're missing the bigger picture. So, for whatever it's worth, that's...
Yeah, thank you so much for raising up that summary, that the idea that this is really just getting at this question of we worship a holy God, how do we live holy lives that reflect we worship this holy God, and have been given a holy call, I would also add to that. One thing I want to just also though point out about the slaughtering, you're right, like you have to do it just the right way, but Leviticus says that the priest doesn't slaughter, the person sacrificing does.
You're right.
Yeah, and then I only point that out just because it's very interesting that it's that personal involvement, right? That I'm going to sacrifice the animal, that I, like for my sins or for whatever I have done wrong. And that was what we talked a little bit about with like the spirituality of sacrifice, is that I'm very viscerally involved in this. Although I would imagine that the rabbis and priests probably helped them out, because yeah, if you've got amateurs doing that, that just sounds like a terrible mess. So, yeah. And I also, one thing we kind of got to do last week with some people was really have this discussion around, because for us today, that still should be the call, right? We aren't so tied to this holy land, but we can think of ourselves as a nation, and I believe that's in Galatians that we're called to a holy nation, and we certainly as Presbyterians hold ourselves to be a priesthood of believers. And how do we live out the fact that we are holy people worshiping a holy God? Because that should still be true for us today, worshiping a holy God. And that's, of course, a question of how do we hold together this Old Testament belief with the New Testament belief, and how do we do that? And should we be doing that? How do we do it?
One commentator said that one of the things to take away is that in Leviticus, the priests had to get the sacrifices. In the New Testament, Jesus was the priest and the sacrifice.
Mhm.
So there was no need to find a sacrifice. He was the sacrifice.
Right. That's a really interesting point that Hebrews make, that Jesus is the priest and the sacrifice. That's where it kind of gets into this order of Melchizedek, and that there was, because Jesus was not a Levite, not by his lineage. So they had to make this jump of, well, how can we do this sacrificial system? It's a metaphor, it's not perfect. But they made that jump of Melchizedek, who was a priest but not a Levite. And then Jesus was the sacrifice, and he was the great priest, and he could do that and go into the Holy of Holies in heaven. Well, for reaching a close, I have one thing I need to say, which is thank you. Because I am so very grateful to all of you and to Southminster for welcoming me back. I'm thankful to Discipling for letting me do this. And to Pastors Liz and Matt for supporting me in this and helping with all this. And of course, most of all, thanks be to God. No, seriously, that is something that does strike me about this. And something that I read early on when I was first studying Leviticus is, this was God's way of interacting with the people and giving them a way to live with God. And my joke always when I tell people, like, oh yeah, I really like Leviticus, because they give me this weird look like, what's wrong with you? is I'm really like Leviticus. And I'm also really glad I don't live by Leviticus. And I do mean that. Thanks be to God that God has spoken to us through all of time, that God has always interacted with God's people. And thanks be to God for Christ, that we no longer need to live by this, but we still have this. So we have such a deeper, richer understanding. I'm grateful that we do know this. What would it be like if we had just said, like, well, sacrifices don't matter, we're done, Jesus took care of it, and we just forgot? How much deeper can we understand and appreciate what Christ did for us, knowing all this? And as I say here, may God continue to speak to all of us and reveal God's holiness, as I believe God will continue to do so until kingdom come. Amen.